Donald Trump's voice sliced across the CNN town hall stage just as Elizabeth Warren was turning to leave, and the timing felt almost engineered. She had finished her segment. The audience had spent the better part of an hour rewarding her corporate greed lines with applause, and the room had the warm glow of a mission accomplished. Then Trump, standing at the moderator's table instead of sitting like a normal guest, held up a thick folder and spoke like someone who'd decided small talk was a waste of oxygen. Anderson Cooper tried to interrupt, but Trump kept rolling, as if the rules of the format no longer applied to him. What came next, in my view, wasn't a debate so much as a live demonstration of how quickly a polished narrative can get rattled by paperwork. Trump's opening line wasn't subtle, and it didn't bother pretending to be. He framed it as a challenge. If Warren wanted to talk about corruption, then he wanted to talk about her record, and he wanted to do it with documents. The crowd, which had been clapping seconds earlier, went quiet in that way people do when they sense they're about to witness a collision. Warren froze mid-step, half off stage, and you could practically see her team calculating whether staying off camera would look worse than walking back into the blast radius. The audience started chanting for her to return, and once a crowd chant starts, it's basically a conveyor belt that drags everyone's dignity into the spotlight. Back in the wings, her staff swarmed like a pit crew that suddenly realized the car might not have brakes. You could almost hear the whispered logic. Walk away and it looks like you're hiding. Go back out, and you might get cornered in real time. That's the trap with live television. Refusal becomes its own storyline, and the storyline never needs evidence to travel fast. So Warren walked back out, wearing the kind of controlled expression you put on when you're trying to turn anxiety into posture. And the second she sat down, Trump dropped the folder on the table like a prop from a courtroom drama. In the version of events presented on stage, the papers weren't vague accusations. They were meant to look like receipts. He held up contracts with corporate letterheads, bank statements, photocopied checks, and he kept pointing to a signature as if it were a fingerprint. He named companies, listed dollar amounts, and described the work as helping corporate clients minimize payouts to workers and victims. Warren opened her mouth to respond, but Trump moved faster than her sentences could form, stacking one document on top of another. The effect wasn't just confrontation, it was pace, the kind that makes explanations sound like excuses before they're even spoken. He told the audience, in so many words, that baseless didn't matter if your name is on the page. He held up a sheet, said "travelers," and attached it to an emotionally heavy example involving asbestos victims because that's how persuasion works. Then he flipped to another corporate name, another check, another story about liability, another implied contradiction with Warren's public brand. Whether every on-stage characterization was fair or not, the staging was clear. Trump was daring her to deny the authenticity of documents in front of millions. And if you've watched politics long enough, you know that deny this paperwork is an ugly dare, because the denial has to be perfect. Warren tried to respond with the language of process, the vocabulary of law and policy. She reached for what a former professor would reach for: complex proceedings, standard practice, adpaciti, expert testimony. Context matters. That's a rational defense in a seminar room, but it can sound like fog on a stage where people want a yes or no answer. Trump kept translating her nuance into a blunt moral narrative, insisting the work helped powerful interests at the expense of ordinary people. And when a crowd senses blood in the water, it doesn't reward footnotes. The segment then rewound, telling viewers how Warren's day started with confidence and a sense of momentum. She wakes in an expensive Cambridge house, a beautiful place in an elite neighborhood, and she's framed as feeling validated by a newspaper story about inequality. Her home office is described like a shrine to the progressive brand. Academic books, framed photos with party icons, a workspace built for righteous preparation. Her staff arrives with coffee and a briefing book, and she starts rehearsing attacks the way candidates rehearse sermons. The story makes her feel sure she'll set the narrative first and force Trump to spend his hour defending himself. Her team runs through talking points that are designed to land cleanly with viewers. They want corporate tax cuts, billionaire cabinet members, broken worker promises, and a pivot to her own economic agenda. There's polling talk, the kind that makes politics feel like fantasy sports, and the promise that a strong night could reshape the race. Warren, in this telling, is confident because she believes framing is power, and she spent a lifetime framing arguments for a living. But the story insists she doesn't realize Trump is preparing in a completely different mode. Less defense, more counterpunch. Over in Trump Tower, the scene shifts to binders and opposition research. Trump's team is portrayed as having dug through years of Warren's professional work, collecting contracts, disclosures, and timelines. They describe her brand as the crusader against corporate abuse, then claim her private earnings tell a different story. In this narrative, the contrast is the whole point. A public persona built on battling corporate power and a private record that raises uncomfortable questions. Trump's team calls it hypocrisy, and they believe hypocrisy is the easiest kind of damage to sell. They argue that her consulting and expert witness work adds up to a large number over many years. They place those payments in emotionally loaded contexts: bankruptcies, liabilities, workers losing benefits, because emotions make numbers feel like accusations. They also claim to have a second storyline, that her signature policy achievement, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was structured in a way that benefited ideological allies. In the onstage framing, settlement money is described as flowing not simply to harmed consumers, but also to organizations with political identities. Whether that's a fair summary or an aggressive spin, the story presents it as proof that her moral posture has a financial and political underside. Then comes a third thread: trading activity tied to her committee role. The narrative suggests a pattern where briefings about markets or regulations were followed by trades that later looked lucky. It implies that timing itself is suspicious, even if the underlying mechanics are complicated by advisors, disclosures, and legal boundaries. This part is written to feel forensic: dates, amounts, stock names, because for many viewers, spreadsheets feel more credible than speeches. And it's also written to feel explosive, because it suggests the kind of advantage ordinary people can't get, even if they work 2 jobs. The strategy, as described, is to let Warren spend her hour building a moral case against Trump. Then Trump would respond not with philosophy, but with what he calls receipts, and he would pressure the network to bring Warren back. That's the key psychological play. Get her relaxed, get her backstage, then drag her back into a confrontation without a prepared counter-narrative. His team frames unprecedented as an advantage, because unprecedented is basically a synonym for viral. And the story treats virality as the modern court of public opinion, faster than any committee or ethics process. Warren finishes her segment strong, her team celebrates, and she assumes she has controlled the terrain. Then a producer asks her to stay available for follow-ups, which sounds routine until it doesn't. When Trump begins his segment, he doesn't sit down, and that small staging detail signals something is off. He mentions documents. He asks for Warren to return, and the network, according to the story, goes along with it because the moment is too big to resist. From there, the narrative turns into a slow tightening, where Warren is asked to respond live to claims anchored to visible paper. When Warren returns, She tries to keep the exchange on the level of tone and propriety. She suggests it's inappropriate. She calls the attack baseless. She tries to reassert the rules of the format. Trump ignores the format and keeps pointing to signatures and numbers because he's selling certainty, not civility. To the audience, he frames each document as a simple moral story. Corporate money in, ordinary people lose out, and the champion took the check anyway. Warren keeps trying to reintroduce context, and context keeps getting swatted away as word games. At that point, the scene expands beyond a personal clash into a larger critique of political branding. Warren's defenders would say professional work in complex cases isn't automatically immoral, and that expert testimony can serve the system rather than exploit it. Her critics would say the optics are brutal. A politician running on anti-corporate rhetoric while cashing large corporate checks in prior decades. Trump's whole play is to collapse the distinction between legal and legitimate, because viewers often judge legitimacy first. And it works on television because the camera rewards bluntness more than it rewards nuance. The CFPB segment is treated as a second hammer because it targets her signature accomplishment. Trump claims settlement money flowed to groups that look politically aligned, and he frames that as a pipeline from government enforcement to ideological infrastructure. Warren tries to describe the organizations as legitimate community service providers, the kind that offer counseling or assistance. Trump keeps labeling them as activist outfits, and he presents lists and numbers to make it feel definitive. The audience reaction in the script isn't uniformly partisan. It's confused, which is often more damaging than anger. Then the trading segment arrives, and this is where the story aims for maximum discomfort. Trump presents a string of examples designed to look like briefing, trade, profit, and he repeats it until repetition itself becomes the argument. Warren tries to explain the role of an advisor, which is plausible on its face, but it doesn't satisfy a crowd that wants accountability in plain English. Trump frames it as ordinary Americans playing the market blind, while senators play with a flashlight, which is the kind of metaphor that sticks. Even if every example would require careful verification in the real world, the live moment is built to make her look unable to answer directly. The narrative then pivots into the heritage controversy, but it does it with a political sneer rather than a policy debate. Trump references a derogatory nickname he has used, and Warren objects, and the exchange becomes more heat than light. He brings up old faculty listings and diversity claims, framing them as opportunism, while she frames her story as family history and identity. This is the kind of topic that turns into a spectacle instantly, because it's personal and symbolic at the same time. In the story, it lands less as a resolution and more as another pressure point, another moment where she looks cornered. As the minutes pass, the audience begins interrupting, demanding simple answers. That's a nightmare for any politician, because simple answers often sound worse than complex truths. A woman stands and says she supported Warren, and now she wants a straight response, not a lecture. Warren keeps reaching for structure and explanation, and the crowd keeps demanding a binary. Trump, meanwhile, keeps speaking in binaries because binaries win on live television. Warren finally walks off, and in the language of the story, that is treated as the decisive image. It doesn't matter why she left, or whether she left because the segment was chaotic, unfair, or strategically hopeless. The camera sees a chair left empty, and empty chairs become symbols faster than any fact check can travel. Trump gathers his papers, claims victory, and exits with the posture of someone who believes the night went exactly as planned. Cooper tries to land the plane, but the plane is already on social media doing barrel rolls. The next section is written like a cultural autopsy of how a moment becomes a national narrative. Clips circulate, not as edited conspiracies but as raw-seeming segments that viewers treat like self-explanatory evidence. People don't argue about policy. They argue about character. And character arguments are easier because they don't require math. In this telling, even friendly outlets can't ignore what was on the table because the table was on camera. And once a storyline becomes "she couldn't answer," the content of the questions almost stops mattering. Then the political consequences arrive in a cascade that feels dramatic by design. A powerful party figure calls Warren and speaks coldly, not offering comfort but warning about damage to the party. Donors call, not to hear nuance but to distance themselves from the stink of scandal. Staff panic, committees whisper, and the machine that once protected her begins recalculating whether protection is worth the cost. The narrative treats this as the real brutality of modern politics. Not prison bars, but abandonment. Investigations are introduced as confirmations, but the responsible way to hear them is as allegations moving through institutions. The story names regulators, ethics bodies, and internal reviews, presenting them as if they validate the on-stage claims. In real life, those processes are slow and technical, but a viral narrative doesn't wait for technicalities to finish their coffee. The script uses the language of inevitability. Polls drop, donors flee, committees act, because inevitability is what makes a story feel satisfying. Whether that inevitability is earned is a separate question, and it's the kind of viewer should keep in their pocket. We then get the resignation arc, framed as a forced retreat rather than a voluntary decision. A written statement is described as polished and vague, heavy on pride and light on specifics. Media retrospectives declare the moment definitive, because modern commentary loves a single night that ended it all. Warren is described as retreating into private life, while institutions finalize outcomes that the narrative treats as settled. And the story ends by claiming the ultimate irony. A candidate who built her brand on exposing rigged systems gets swallowed by the perception of her own rigging. If I'm giving you my honest commentary voice on this kind of story, I'll say this. These scenes are built to be watched like a courtroom, but they're really built like a wrestling match with better lighting. The documents may be real, the numbers may be real, and the interpretations may still be contested, because interpretation is where politics lives. A contract can be authentic without proving the worst moral framing attached to it, and a timeline can look damning without proving intent. But live television rarely rewards the sentence that begins with "it depends," even when "it depends" is the most accurate sentence in the language. What keeps viewers glued isn't the policy detail, it's the discomfort of watching a powerful person lose control of the script. That's why the yes or no demands matter more than the underlying files in the public imagination. It becomes less about whether the claims are legally decisive and more about whether the target looks steady under pressure. And when someone walks off stage, the walk-off becomes the argument, because the image doesn't need context to spread. So the larger theme isn't just Warren versus Trump. It's politics versus its own incentives, and the camera always gets the final vote. And here's where the story usually keeps going, because one viral night doesn't end anything in Washington, it just opens a new lane for everyone to drive recklessly in. The morning after a televised collision like that, the real fight isn't on stage anymore. It's in the interpretations. People don't wake up asking, "What's the full context of those documents?" They wake up asking, "Who won?" And who looked guilty? And who looked rattled? That's not me praising the public. That's me describing the public, including the parts of me that are just as human as everyone else. When politics becomes entertainment, composure becomes currency, and the first thing the audience buys is the vibe. Within hours, clips get chopped into snack-sized morality plays, and each slice tells a slightly different story depending on who posted it. One edit makes Trump look like a ruthless auditor with a file folder and a stopwatch. Another edit makes Warren look like the victim of a stage-managed ambush. A third edit doesn't even care about either candidate. It just loves the moment where the crowd demands yes or no, because audiences love the illusion of control. You can feel the country splitting into different living rooms, each watching the same footage but hearing different subtext. And if you've been paying attention for the last decade, you already know what happens next. The side characters rush in to narrate it for you. By mid-morning, the usual suspects are on cable panels acting like they were in the room when the paperwork was printed. Some insist this is accountability. Others insist it's smear, and very few people admit the unsexy truth that both things can exist in the same zip code. What does accountability look like on live TV when neither side has subpoena power and the only rule is the commercial break? What does smear even mean anymore when the materials being waved around are framed as public records? But the conclusions are treated like verdicts. If you're a voter trying to stay sane, you end up doing this awkward balancing act. You don't want to be gullible, but you also don't want to be cynical enough to ignore everything. Meanwhile, Warren's team, in any realistic version of this, would be doing what every campaign does after a bad night. Triage. First, they'd call friendly voices, not to lie, but to set a frame that can survive in a headline. They'd emphasize that consulting work and expert testimony are common for academics, and that context matters, and that helping a client is not the same as endorsing a client. They'd likely point out that being paid for technical legal work over a long career doesn't automatically translate into betrayal of values. And they'd try, desperately, to get the conversation out of the courtroom tone Trump is selling and back into a policy argument where Warren usually breathes easier. But Trump's team wouldn't be sleeping either, because the best part of a hit is the second swing. They'd be pushing the most damaging clips to every influencer and aggregator who can turn a 10-second stare into a week-long narrative. They'd be feeding producers a simple storyline. She talks purity, he brought paper, because that's a story even a distracted viewer can retell. They'd be urging surrogates to keep asking the same question over and over, because repetition creates memory, and memory creates common knowledge, even when the truth is messier. And they'd make sure every conversation circles back to the image of Warren leaving the stage, because in politics, leaving is the closest thing to admitting you lost. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you a document waved on television proves a moral indictment by itself. A contract can be proof of payment without being proof of motive, and legal work can be ethically neutral even if the optics are brutal. At the same time, optics are not a side dish in politics. Optics are the main course, and we all pretend we're not eating them. So the more honest question is, why do certain optics feel like betrayal even when the underlying practice is normal? And a second question follows right behind it. Why do we excuse normal practices when they benefit people we like, but call them scandals when they benefit people we don't? Take the expert witness angle, for example. If you're a law professor with expertise in bankruptcy, corporations are going to hire you, and courts are going to hear you, and your opinion is going to help someone's case. That's the job. And it's a job the system created, because the system loves credentialed referees. But the public doesn't experience it as the system hiring expertise. They experience it as the powerful buying brains, and honestly, that's not an irrational interpretation. So when Warren is framed as the anti-corporate champion, and then old payments are placed next to suffering workers, the audience doesn't ask what the legal norms were, they ask what the moral story is. And that's where Trump's approach, fair or not, is strategically brutal. He doesn't argue about bankruptcy theory, he argues about who got hurt and who got paid, and who gets to stand on a stage pretending they never touched the money. He makes the moral math simple enough to chant, which is always a sign you're no longer in the realm of nuance. Warren's instinct is to explain complexity. But complexity sounds like evasiveness when the other side is offering a one-syllable answer. You can't out-lecture a crowd that thinks you're dodging because the lecture itself becomes the dodge in their minds. Then there's the CFPB thread, and this is where the storyline starts to matter beyond two personalities. Even if you believe the CFPB did real good for consumers, the question of where settlement money goes is the kind of question that can either sound like governance or sound like a racket. If the money flows to organizations that are politically active, critics can say it looks like ideology disguised as restitution, and supporters can say it looks like community repair. Both frames can be sincere, and that's the problem. Because sincerity doesn't settle disputes, it just makes them louder. What does a neutral distribution even look like in a country where almost every large nonprofit has a policy agenda and donors with expectations? And notice how quickly a viewer's brain drifts from policy structure to rigged pipeline. That drift happens because we've all seen enough sweetheart arrangements in other parts of life to assume politics is doing the same thing with better vocabulary. So even if the underlying mechanics are complex, the perception is simple. Someone powerful can direct money, and money tends to find friends. Is that perception always accurate in a specific case? Not necessarily, but perception is powerful precisely because it doesn't need to be fully accurate to shape behavior. Now add the trading after briefings angle, and you're pouring gasoline on a public already allergic to insider advantage. Americans can tolerate a lot of things, but they don't tolerate the idea that the game is fixed for people who get to hear the rules early. Whether Warren's trades were made by an advisor, whether they were routine, whether they complied with reporting rules, those are details that matter to investigators. To the average viewer, the only detail that matters is the pattern, especially if someone on stage repeats the pattern like it's a chorus. And once the audience feels that pattern, every explanation sounds like a loophole, and every loophole sounds like a confession. So the broader consequence isn't just damage to one candidate. It's the deepening belief that the people who shout loudest about ethics are often the most practiced at navigating the gray zones. That belief isn't new, but moments like this renew it. And they renew it with fresh video that people can replay until it hardens into certainty. And when certainty hardens, democratic debate gets replaced by tribal sorting. Either you think it's all a setup, or you think it's all an exposure. Where does that leave the viewer who thinks some things can be true at the same time, like these payments happened and the conclusions being sold are still debatable? It leaves you in the most unpopular place in modern America. The middle, where you get yelled at by both sides for not being emotionally useful. If you say, "Show me more context," one side hears, "Stop accountability." If you say, "The optics are bad," the other side hears, "You're buying the smear." And that's how a country ends up with fewer honest conversations and more performative certainty, because certainty is rewarded and caution is treated like weakness. Politics doesn't just select leaders, it selects emotional habits. And the habit we're selecting right now is snap judgment. Now, if Warren is smart, and she is, she would understand that the only way out of a vibe verdict is a counter-image, not a counter-brief. She wouldn't just release statements, she'd do a sit-down where she answers the questions in plain English without sounding like she's grading the audience. She'd say, "Yes, I did paid expert work. Here's why. Here's what I believe about it now." And she'd do it without hiding behind jargon. She'd address the easiest to understand accusation first, because ignoring the obvious is how you lose people who want to like you. And she'd stop trying to win the argument and start trying to win trust, because you can't litigate your way out of a credibility problem on social media. But the script you're building isn't really about whether Warren executes perfect damage control. It's about how the machine reacts when someone's brand gets punctured on live television. You'd see Democrats quietly shifting away, not because they suddenly discovered ethics, but because they discovered risk. You'd see Republicans amplifying, not because they suddenly discovered transparency, but because they discovered leverage. And you'd see media outlets caught in the middle, because they love drama, but also hate being accused of enabling it, which is like a pyromaniac complaining about smoke. And here's the cynical punchline. Every institution involved can claim it's acting out of principle, even while acting out of self-preservation. Campaigns claim principle when they call for investigations, but they also know investigations are weapons, even when justified. Networks claim principle when they ask tough questions, but they also know that tough questions are profitable, especially when someone squirms. Donors claim principle when they withdraw support, but donors also treat politics like an investment portfolio and cut losses when the stock dips. So when the public asks, "Who can we trust?" the honest answer is, trust is scarce because everyone is incentivized to spend it. If you want to keep the tension high for a long voiceover piece, you lean into that discomfort instead of pretending there's a clean hero. You don't say Warren is guilty of anything. You say the spectacle raises questions that don't go away just because we want them to. You don't say Trump is a truth teller. You say Trump understands the power of selective framing and he uses it like a hammer. You don't claim the documents prove a crime. You emphasize how quickly the public jumps from paper exists to verdict delivered. And you keep asking the viewer the one question that nags underneath the whole thing. In a country where everyone suspects everyone, what does proof even look like anymore? Because here's what's really being sold in moments like this. Not policy, not statutes, not committee rules. What's being sold is moral clarity, packaged as a confrontation, with props that look like evidence and timing that looks like strategy. And moral clarity is addictive when you're exhausted, because exhaustion makes nuance feel like work. So a segment like this spreads not just because it's dramatic, but because it gives people permission to stop thinking and start sorting. And once people start sorting, the campaign isn't about ideas, it's about whether you can survive the next clip. If you want to push the narrative forward, the next beat is simple. Warren's allies try to stabilize her, and Trump's allies try to keep her wobbling. The stabilizers will argue that professional work is being weaponized, that public service is being punished, that every politician has a past that can be made ugly in the wrong light. The wobblers will argue that the past isn't the issue, the posture is, and the posture is that she presented herself as something she wasn't. And floating above both camps is the voter who doesn't have the time to read disclosures but has plenty of time to feel disappointed. That disappointment is the real storyline, because disappointed people don't become policy experts. They become easier targets for the next simple narrative. So the question I'd leave hanging, without pretending I can answer it for anyone, is this. When a politician builds a career on moral condemnation, are they obligated to be morally spotless? Or just legally compliant? Or something in between that nobody can define? When a politician gets confronted with uncomfortable facts, is the right move to explain, to apologize, to deny, or to refuse the premise entirely? And when the public sees a walk-off, are they witnessing a refusal to participate in theater Or are they witnessing someone who ran out of room to maneuver? That's the kind of ambiguity your script can live in, because ambiguity is where real political persuasion happens, even when everyone pretends they want certainty.